Welcome. We hope you're doing well wherever you're watching from. Let us know in the comments which city you're from. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another touching story. Let's dive right in. Get ready for a heartwarming journey that will surely tug at your heartstrings. Chapter 1. A cold morning and a desperate family. It was a chilly morning. The kind where the fog clung to the ground, thick and impenetrable. As the early light struggled to break through, the road was still. The world held in a breathless silence as James Mercer, a 50-year-old long-haul trucker, made his way down Interstate 95. For James, the highway had become his second home. He'd spent decades behind the wheel of his Freightliner, a truck that was more familiar to him than his own living room. It wasn't just the job, it was his escape. Since losing his wife, Kate, to cancer a year ago, his life had been full of nothing but long stretches of lonely roads and distant memories. The miles seemed endless that morning. The constant hum of the engine, the crackle of the radio playing old country songs, the only company he had on these desolate roads. The loneliness was familiar, though never any easier to bear. The pain of losing Kate never seemed to fade, it just became a part of him. Like the passing of time. As he drove, James didn't expect much beyond the usual. But then, something caught his eye. Off to the side of the highway, he noticed a shape in the mist. It wasn't something he'd normally stop for. There were always things discarded along the road. But this time, there was something about the shape that made him pause. It was different. It wasn't debris. It wasn't just some trash. Slowly, James eased the truck to the shoulder, his heart starting to pound in his chest. He knew he had a schedule to keep, but something inside him urged him to stop. As the truck came to a halt, he grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. He hadn't thought about that flashlight in a while. It was a gift from Kate. One of the last things she'd given him before she passed. Light always attracts light, she'd told him with a smile. Now, the words felt like a quiet call to action. He stepped out into the cold morning air, wrapping his coat tighter around him as the mist curled around his feet. The sound of the distant traffic faded as he walked towards the small, trembling form in the snow. As he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. There, lying on the side of the road, was a dog. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes full of desperation, but also a flicker of hope. Her coat was filthy, matted with dirt and ice, and she shivered uncontrollably, her body too weak to move much. The dog wasn't alone. Around her, 4 tiny puppies huddled together, their tiny bodies trembling in the cold. James's heart sank as he realized the severity of the situation. It was clear this dog, this family, had been abandoned, left to die on the side of the road. Just another casualty of an uncaring world. The sight hit James harder than he expected. His gut twisted as the reality of the situation set in. This wasn't just a dog. This was a mother, doing everything she could to protect her babies from the cold. And for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, the need to help. He crouched down, his voice soft and gentle as he spoke to the dog, trying to reassure her that he wasn't a threat. "It's okay, girl, I'm here to help you." The dog hesitated at first, her eyes scanning his face with caution. But after a moment, she took a step forward, allowing James to get closer. He reached into his truck and grabbed a sandwich he'd saved for later. Breaking off a small piece, the mother dog sniffed the air, her hunger outweighing her fear. She took the food from his hand, and James could feel a connection form between them. However small, he carefully gathered the puppies, one by one, cradling them in his arms. They were weak, too young to understand the danger they were in, but they trusted their mother. And that was enough. He knew he couldn't just leave them there. "Let's get you to safety," James whispered, gently lifting the puppies into his truck. The mother dog followed, her eyes never leaving him. As they all climbed into the cab, James felt a strange sense of peace. He had no idea what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something right. Something good. Chapter 2. The Unlikely Bond. James drove for hours, the soft sound of Rosie, the mother dog, and her puppies settling into the back seat of his truck, a welcome distraction from the silence that had been his constant companion for so long. The road stretched out ahead of him, but today, it felt different. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. The soft whimpering of the puppies mixed with Rosie's occasional growl made the cabin feel alive again, reminding him of the purpose he had lost after Kate's passing. As he looked back at the little family in his rearview mirror, his heart swelled with an unfamiliar feeling, responsibility. By the time he reached Pinewood Station, where he usually made his rest stop, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the highway. He pulled into the small station, parking his truck next to the fuel pump. The bright lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow against the gathering darkness. Sarah, the attendant, greeted him as she always did. She had red hair tied into a messy bun and a permanent kind smile on her face. She noticed the small family immediately. Her sharp eyes softened when she saw Rosie and the puppies huddling together in the back of James's truck. "Tom, what did you find this time?" Sarah asked with a touch of curiosity in her voice. James smiled faintly, his expression somber as he gently climbed out of the cab and opened the door to the back. "Something that's going to break your heart," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he looked at the family of dogs. He stepped aside to let Sarah see for herself. The moment Sarah saw the mother dog and her puppies, she froze. She knew something was terribly wrong. "You can't leave them like this," Sarah said, her voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "What happened to them?" "I don't know," James admitted. "Someone threw them out, just left them on the side of the road. I couldn't just keep going." Sarah crouched down next to Rosie, reaching out her hand to the mother dog, who eyed her warily. But hunger and exhaustion eventually won out, and Rosie approached, letting Sarah stroke her back lightly. Sarah ran her hand through the dog's matted fur, feeling the chill in her skin. "This is bad," Sarah said softly, her gaze meeting James's. "They look like they've been out here for a while. They need food, and fast." Mike, the station mechanic, appeared beside them, wiping his greasy hands on his old work shirt. "I'll bring out a box and some towels," he said, moving toward the back of the station. "At least we can give them some comfort while we figure out what to do." James watched Rosie as she allowed Sarah to care for her puppies. The bond between mother and child was clear in her watchful eyes. The little ones were too small, too fragile to understand the danger they had narrowly escaped. Yet, they instinctively clung to their mother, trusting her to protect them no matter what. "You know," Sarah continued, looking up at James, "we've seen a lot of abandoned animals come through here, but nothing like this." She paused, her face turning grim. "This is the third case we've seen this week." James's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Sarah bit her lip as she glanced over at the puppies, her voice low. "Something's off. This isn't just random. I think we have a bigger problem on our hands." James had already suspected something wasn't right. The way the puppies huddled together so desperately. The strange collar Rosie wore. The mark barely visible. Something about it felt too coordinated. Rosie's collar had a half-erased symbol on it, one that seemed oddly familiar. It unsettled him. He had seen something like it before. "I don't like this," Mike added, returning with the box and towels. He eyed the group suspiciously, especially the black car that had passed by once already. "You saw that, right? That car slowing down and then speeding off? Something's not right here." Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the shelter. As she spoke with Mary, the shelter manager, she turned back to James. "Mary's going to help, but it's not good. The shelter's full. She said they've been getting reports of similar cases, too." James's heart sank as he thought about his own journey. He still had a delivery to make in Portland, but how could he leave now? He'd already made his decision, and something deep inside told him there was no turning back. He couldn't abandon them. "How long do we have, do you think?" James asked, glancing at the puppies as they nursed from Rosie, their small bodies shaking from the cold. "I'm not sure," Sarah said, her face thoughtful, "but they can't stay out here long." Tom made the call to his company, explaining the situation. He told them he had an emergency. Some deliveries could wait, but saving lives wasn't something he could ignore. As he spoke, the pup's tiny whines tugged at his heart. Rosie, too, was tired, her body battered by the journey. But she kept looking at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Hours later, Mary arrived at Pinewood Station in her personal car, a worn-out blue sedan. Her green eyes were tired but filled with purpose. She took one look at the dogs and immediately began making plans. "We have a bigger problem than I thought," Mary said, showing James photos of other animals, all with the same mark on their collars. A small circle, faded but still visible, with a symbol James didn't recognize. His stomach churned. He remembered seeing an advertisement a few weeks ago about a dog breeder called Golden Paws. A business liquidating all their dogs. That memory came back like a flash of light. Mary continued, Golden Paws shut down recently. But no one knows where their animals went. We're finding them abandoned, all over New England. Tom had a bad feeling. Something he couldn't ignore. The situation was escalating fast. And the lives of these animals were at risk. But who could he trust? Was this just an accident? Or was there something more to it? What do you think is really going on here? Who is behind the abandonment of these dogs? Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out how James and the team uncover the truth. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 3. The Unveiling of the Truth. The next few hours moved like a blur for James, Sarah, Mike, and Mary. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on all of them, and they worked quickly to make sure Rosie and her puppies were comfortable. The puppies were still so small, so fragile, that every moment felt like it mattered. James couldn't stop thinking about them, about the way Rosie had looked at him with so much trust in her eyes. She had been through hell, and yet, she had still shown a willingness to depend on him. It was more than he could comprehend at that moment. With the puppies in the back kennel at Pinewood Station, tucked under blankets, and Rosie resting beside them, the group tried to figure out what to do next. The phone call to the shelter had yielded little hope, and as Mary went over her notes, James felt a knot in his stomach. Something wasn't right, and he had the feeling that the situation was far from over. Sarah returned from the back of the station with more bad news. I just checked online. There's been a report about a breeder, Golden Paws. They've been liquidating their stock, all of their dogs, and there's something off about this whole thing. We need to figure out where these animals came from. James froze, the memories of the ad about Golden Paws flickering in his mind. His suspicions were starting to form, but he didn't want to believe it. His heart told him that these dogs, especially Rosie, deserved so much more than just a life of abandonment. There had to be a reason they had been discarded like this. You don't think? Mary started, her eyes scanning over the small family in the kennel. Do you think these pups are from that breeder? James took a step closer to Rosie, who was now licking her puppies gently, her eyes softening as she looked up at him. He didn't want to believe it, but the signs were undeniable. The collar with that strange mark, the way the puppies seemed weaker than they should have been. He ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. He couldn't just walk away, not after everything he'd seen. We need to find out for sure, James said, determination starting to take root in his voice. I won't leave them to suffer like this. Sarah made a call to a local veterinarian who was known for helping with animal rescues. The next morning, they made their way to the clinic, taking Rosie and the puppies with them. As they entered the clinic, the scent of antiseptic filled the air, making James feel even more uneasy. He had never liked these places. But this was different. He wasn't just there as a truck driver looking to get a quick checkup for his dog. He was there to uncover the truth. The waiting room was crowded with people, all sitting in silence as they waited for their appointments. James looked around, scanning the faces of those who were just trying to care for their animals. He had been one of them once, a man trying to do his best by his dog. But now, things felt so different. Dr. Anderson, the veterinarian, led them into an examination room. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a thick mustache. He looked at Rosie and her puppies with concern. This is not normal, he muttered, running his hands over the puppies' fragile bodies. There's something wrong here. James felt a tightening in his chest. What do you mean? Dr. Anderson didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked them to bring the puppies to the back for some tests. Rosie stayed with James, her eyes never leaving him as he sat in the sterile room, waiting for news. He wasn't sure how much longer he could handle the tension. The entire situation felt off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to these animals. After what felt like hours, Dr. Anderson returned, his face grave. I've examined the puppies, and there's something I need to show you, he said, his voice serious. There are genetic anomalies in these puppies, and it's not a coincidence. Someone was trying to breed a new bloodline, but they've gone wrong. James's stomach dropped. He had heard rumors about breeding facilities and the terrible things that happened there. But to hear it confirmed was another matter entirely. What does that mean for them? They'll need special care. Dr. Anderson explained. This isn't just about giving them food and water. These puppies are suffering from something that will require long-term care. And frankly, I'm not sure if they'll make it. They need to be in a specialized clinic. The news hit James harder than he expected. He had already made sacrifices for them. But this was more than he was prepared for. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing on him. His life, his future, everything he had been working for, was now tied to these animals. And he didn't know what to do. Dr. Anderson's next words hit like a freight train. We've seen this before, James. These puppies are part of something bigger. They were bred by a network of illegal breeders. There's a place called Golden Paws. They've been selling defective dogs for years. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. Golden Paws, the breeder he had heard about, had been breeding dogs for a new, more profitable bloodline, but it hadn't worked. Instead, the puppies were suffering, left to die because they were no longer useful. James's blood ran cold. He remembered the conversation he overheard a month ago at a roadside diner. Two men had been talking about defective merchandise and how to dispose of it. At the time, he didn't understand what they meant, but now it was all clear. I'm going to make sure these dogs get the help they need, James said, his voice unwavering. We need to find these people and stop them. Dr. Anderson nodded grimly. There's a lot we can do, but it's going to take time. It won't be easy, but we can't let these puppies die for nothing. They left the clinic with a clear sense of purpose. James felt a fire in his chest. These puppies weren't just a burden. They were his chance to do something good in a world that had been so unkind to them. Chapter 4. The Final Stand. James couldn't remember a time when he felt this much urgency, this much weight on his shoulders. Everything had changed overnight, and the sense of responsibility he now felt for Rosie and her puppies was unlike anything he'd ever known. He had spent years on the road, traveling alone, and though he had the occasional companion, his old dog Rusty, he never imagined his life would be so intimately tied to an abandoned family of dogs. The Golden Paws breeder was now his target, and despite the constant pressure of his trucking career and mounting concerns over the puppy's health, James couldn't back down. He knew what he had to do. He needed to make sure these animals weren't discarded like garbage again. They were living beings, just like him, deserving of a chance to live. His resolve hardened as he walked through the station with Rosie by his side. The puppies, now slightly stronger after a few days of treatment, were a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. They weren't just victims, they were symbols of hope, of redemption. Their fight for survival mirrored his own. After all, losing his wife had left him hollow, a man without purpose for so long. And now, he was fighting for a cause that felt more meaningful than any delivery he had ever made. Mary had been a lifeline in all of this. She had already started reaching out to local animal shelters and rescue organizations to alert them of the situation. They knew the stakes were high. Golden Paws wasn't just a single breeder. It was part of a much larger network of illegal operations. And James wasn't about to sit idly by. He had heard the whispers about the so-called designer dogs being bred for profit. But seeing the results of those efforts firsthand shook him to his core. The genetic mutations that had caused the puppies' poor health were just the beginning. They needed evidence. They needed the truth to come to light. And James wasn't afraid to stand up to those who tried to profit off the suffering of innocent animals. The pressure was mounting, but he was determined. The first step in their fight came when they received a tip from an anonymous source. Someone had reported seeing Golden Paws employees disposing of animals in a remote area near Providence, and the police had launched an investigation. James, Sarah, and Mike drove to the location as quickly as they could. But they were met with a harsh reality. The site was surrounded by fences, and the further they pushed toward the edge of the property, the more they realized how large the operation was. It was evident now that Golden Paws was more than just one breeder. It was an empire built on cruelty. James could feel his hands tighten around the steering wheel. He was no longer just trying to help a family of abandoned dogs. He was now trying to stop a business that had no remorse for its actions. This wasn't just a fight for Rosie and her puppies. It was a fight to stop this kind of cruelty from happening ever again. We're close, Mary said from the backseat, her voice tinged with both hope and dread. The police have been tracking Golden Paws for months. But they've been careful. We're going to need solid evidence." Mike nodded, his face hard as stone. He had become just as committed to this cause as James, especially after seeing the cruelty firsthand. "We've got to get in there and find something they can't deny. We've been patient long enough." As they approached the edge of the property, they parked a little way off, hidden from sight, and walked the rest of the distance on foot. The air was damp with the scent of pine and mud, and every step seemed to echo through the quiet woods. They moved like shadows, creeping toward the warehouse-like building that loomed in the distance. Inside, they knew, was where the experiments had been carried out. It was where the lives of so many innocent dogs had been altered forever. Their breathing slowed, and their steps became even quieter. The closer they got, the more tense the air felt. James's pulse was racing. He could see the outline of a guard at the gate and the lights that lit up the area, making it difficult for anyone to approach undetected. But they had to try. They spent the next few hours circling the perimeter, looking for a weakness, a gap in the security that would allow them to get inside. Finally, it was Mike who spotted an opening in the fence. It wasn't large, but it was enough for them to squeeze through. They moved as quickly as they could, crawling through the brush, using the darkness to their advantage. James's heart was pounding, but there was no turning back now. Once inside, they moved quietly toward the building. The warehouse loomed large in front of them, and the smell of animals hit them like a wall. The stench of cages, of sickness, and of neglect was unbearable. It made James's stomach churn, but he forced himself to focus. They were here for the truth. Inside, they were met with rows upon rows of cages, each containing a dog or puppy, many of them with the same half-erased symbol on their collars that had first caught James's attention. Some were sick, others barely moving, and a few were too weak to stand at all. James couldn't help but feel a wave of nausea rise in his throat as he moved through the cages. Taking it all in, he had known it was bad, but seeing it up close was another level of horror altogether. This is worse than we thought," Mary whispered, her eyes welling with tears as she looked at the animals. "We need to find the records," James said, his voice tight with emotion. "We need proof." They moved quickly through the warehouse, searching for anything that could provide the evidence they needed. Mike, with his familiarity with the place, led them toward a back office. Inside, there were stacks of paperwork, ledgers, and files. James immediately went to work, flipping through the documents, desperate to find something concrete. Then, in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, he found it. It was a list of dogs, their identification numbers, and the breeder's notes. Each entry was marked with the same stylized G, and there were details about the genetic modifications and the ongoing experiments. This was it, the evidence they had been looking for. Before they could leave the room, they heard footsteps approaching. Their hearts nearly stopped, but they managed to hide behind a stack of crates. A man in a dark suit entered the office, and James recognized him immediately. It was George Peterson, the owner of Golden Paws. "You think you can just come in here and steal from me?" Peterson's voice was cold and menacing as he spoke into his phone. He paced back and forth, unaware of the group's presence. "I'll make sure they never speak again." James felt a chill run down his spine. Peterson was just as ruthless as they had imagined. And now, he knew too much. This was no longer just about Rosie and her puppies. This was about taking down an entire network of cruelty. "Get ready," Mary whispered. "We have to get out of here." James nodded. He grabbed the files and motioned for the group to follow him. They needed to leave quickly, and they had what they needed to bring Peterson and his network to justice. The chase was on.